Welcome to Linda's Corner. My name is Linda Bjork, and today we're going to be talking about technological and cultural change. I'm delighted to welcome special guest, Dr. Rick Chromey. Dr. Chromey is an expert in leadership and emerging culture. He's a sought after speaker and the author of over a dozen books, including his most recent book, Gen Tech, an American story of technology, change, and who we really are. You can reach Dr. Chromey at his website, rickchromey.com, and I'll include a link in the description. Welcome, Rick. Thank you so much for joining with me today.
Well, thank you, Linda. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you today.
I am excited. I'm excited to learn something new and exciting today. I checked out your website and I saw these three words. It said history, period, culture, period, faith, period. And I thought, oh my, okay. So what is the meaning of this and the connection and how do they relate to everybody?
A lot of that's just a rebranding of myself in this last year. COVID's kind of changed everything for all of us, and I was just thinking, what are three things that I really want to be known for going forward? And I have really gotten into a history kick here. Writing this book was part of that. Obviously, it's my first history book. I Most of my books deal with church and leadership and education and other areas where I've been proficient. But I've always wanted to. I've been studying generational history and generation and analyzing generations for over 30 years. I was a youth pastor in my former life, and I did a lot of speaking and just helping people understand the millennial generation, writing on the millennial generation, writing on Gen X, and all that. And I just did a lot of analysis and. I was never really satisfied with what I was finding in the general market and the general idea of what we looked at with generations, especially the labels and such. And then about 5 years ago, I fell into this idea of Gen Tech and how technology, I think, is the window to really understand who we are as a generation.
Really? Okay, so let's go there. And I think I remember you mentioning something about the idea that those labels, like the millennials and the generation XYZ, that they kind of need to be rethought a little bit.
Well, yeah. First of all, can we just get beyond the alphabet naming game when it comes to generations? That right there is, Gen X. A lot of people. Let me just give you a brief history lesson here on where we get our generational labels. The word baby boomer first appeared in a book by Landon Jones in 1980, and he wrote a book and called his generation the baby boom generation. And he was not even a historian, although he was a pop historian, I guess you could say. He was an editor for I want to say People magazine, if I recall correctly,
Ah,
one of these general ed magazines, and just did a lot of writing for that and was an editor. But he kind of coined the word baby boomer. But what really stuck more than baby boomer was the frame, the frame being 1946 to 1964. Now, I was born in 1963, so as I started to grow into this in the 80s, when baby boomers kind of became the name for this generation, I was often labeled a baby boomer, and I just never felt like a baby boomer. And then in 1991, there was a book by Strauss and Howe, Neil Howe and William Strauss, called Generations, and that really changed the whole game. In fact, I would like to think Gen Tech is along the same line of a generations book, because what they did was they recast how we looked at generations. They saw generations as being more of a cycle as opposed to a linear path, one generation after another generation, that we actually
okay.
have cycles to our generations, which I thought was interesting and allows you to be kind of prophetic because you can kind of speak into the future as far as what to expect. And Strauss and Howe, although they have their critics, really are fairly, a dominant voice in generational analysis. And I tend to agree with a lot of, especially their maybe not so much their labels, but especially how they hit on the frames, if you will, because they recast what we call Generation X today as being born between 1961 and 1981. And I went,
Oh,
yes, finally someone gets it. 19 Because being born in 63, never felt like a baby boomer. And part of that's going to come out as I started to analyze myself. To me, to be a baby boomer, there are certain uh, I call them markers, memory markers that remind us of kind of put us together as a personality, a collective generation cohort. And these memory markers kind of are there for us to set us. And you cannot be a baby boomer, I don't think, unless you can remember JFK's assassination in
Mm.
1963. And obviously, even being born in 1961, uh, in developmental psychology and developmental,
Can't really remember that.
it just you just don't develop a memory, cultural memory, until you're around 5 years of age. So that became interesting to me because what do you remember? My first cultural memory was actually the space man walking on the moon. You know, that was my first cultural memory. I don't remember much about the Vietnam War. I remember the end of the Vietnam War, but I don't remember the 60s version of the Vietnam War. So
Right.
all those became part of who I was. Anyway, these back to these labels. Gen X, just get on Gen X. In the same year that Strauss and Howe wrote, there was another book by Douglas Copeland that came out, and my generation wasn't known as baby boomers, or those who were born after 60, from 65 to I don't know, 85, around there. They weren't known as baby boomers, but busters. We were busters, and I kind of tended to feel more like a buster. Maybe some of you remember those tags back then. But Copeland comes along and he writes this fiction novel about his generation, and his generation just happens to fit that baby buster, those years, the 60s. Anybody born in the 60s and 70s were kind of Gen X. Well, that's where we got Gen X at. It's from a fiction novel. And it really means nothing when you think about it. What does Gen X mean? It's just
Sounds
ambiguous.
generic.
Well, of course, with the millennial generation being born in the actually in the 80s and 90s, suddenly we needed to have a name for them. Strauss and Howe were the ones that actually used the word millennial. They coined the word millennial, which is significant. But before that, they were called Y, Generation Y, because we
Oh,
had X. If we have an X, we got to have a Generation Y, right?
makes sense.
Yeah, yeah,
Except
and
we're
that's how we
pretty
got
close
that.
to the end of the alphabet, so I guess we're gonna run out of people or names
Well,
or something.
and there's money in all this. This is what people
Why?
don't understand. There's actually money in if you can be the one to name a generation and be famous for that. I mean, again, Strauss and Howe are famous for naming the millennial generation. That's where they made their cup of tea, if you will, and got their speaking gigs and their books and everything. They wrote another book, couple books around that millennial motif. But in 1996, a marketing firm, and I want to say New Zealand, it was an international marketing firm. It wasn't in the States. They decided they needed to name the new generation, because obviously things were changing in the 90s and we needed a new generation being born. And so this generation was still in diapers when we named them Generation Z. And of course, we named them Z because we didn't know what else to name them, because X, Y, and Z marks the spot. And so that's how we got Generation Z, which has stuck like napalm on that bunch. And it's crazy. And the problem, Linda, with all this is that now we're naming the newest generation, which has been born, they're saying around 2010. We're naming them the Alpha generation, which means we're going back to the beginning of the alphabet. So,
Mhm.
Alpha is just
Gonna have
another
to.
word for saying Generation A. So we
Right.
got X, Y, Z, now Generation A. And what's next? Alpha, Beta, Generation Beta.
Well,
It's we got to get out
it
of that.
doesn't take a marketing firm to figure out what letter comes after A, you know?
Yeah. Well, and that's the problem. We have these names and we have these labels, and when you get into then the years that go on, it's all over the map. I mean, once you get past baby boomer and and even baby boomer, the back end, I would say, is even the front end. Baby boomer, if we're candid, the baby boom did not start in 1946. That's when the year the war ended was 1945, and so 1946, everybody comes home and has babies. Yeah, okay. Well,
Right.
actually, soldiers were coming back and having babies, and we saw a baby boom demographically start in 1943, which Strauss and Howe note in their book. They start the baby boom generation at 1943 and end it in 1960, which I think is far more appropriate for that generation. And the same thing with the back end. It's all over the map, and that's part of the reason I wrote this book,
Right.
Linda. It's when I started to look at, and it kind of came out of music more than technology at first.
Music.
I've always had this theory that the music that we listen to between the ages of 10 and 25 is the music that kind of becomes our soundtrack for life.
That is very true.
Okay. So I don't know if I was just kind of putting a great thought with another great thought and it just kind of happened, but I started to recognize how technology that we come of age to, the technology that is what I call a tipping point. In the book, I have a whole chapter on tipping points because not all technology tips. Some of you might remember Betamax. Betamax was the superior way to videotape your television shows. But VHS and Betamax went head to head for a couple of years, but eventually VHS had the tipping
Right.
point
Mhm.
and everything's VHS. Betamax, which was truly a superior, that's why it was called Betamax. It literally means the best, the best of the best. And it is a superior way to videotape, just never took off. So there are tipping points. And when these tipping points happen, and if they happen at a point where a generation is coming of age between the ages of 10 and 25, that becomes their predominant technology. So when you look at those born in the 1940s and 1950s, they're the vinyl record generation. They're the television generation. They're the space generation. When you look at those born in the 60s and 70s, they also are part of the space generation, the back end of the space generation, but they're also the gamer generation, the video games that we have, and also cable television generation. We often don't think about cable television totally reimagined. In fact, television's one of those megatechs. There are certain technologies that are megatechs, and television's one of those because it has multiple gamer. The gamer generation relies upon television technology. Cable
Mhm.
television does. The other one is the internet. Later, when you look at millennials, they're not so much millennials as they are the personal computer, cell phone, internet generation. Those are the
Right.
technologies. Yeah,
That is amazing.
and that's
So
what the book's about.
the point of labeling is to be able to recognize that the connection and how the way that this technology and the way that the culture influence those people, and it kind of creates a I don't know, not really a class, but it that there is a reason behind the labeling, that it's not
Right.
just labeling something, but it kind of tells you a little bit about that person who grew up with this kind of technology and how it affects us. So can you kind of maybe explain, because sometimes people who are millennials say we're getting a real bad rap. I mean, not only are they saying that I'm this, but they're telling me what my personality is, and I'm not a selfish person, and I'm not this and that and the other. um,
Yeah.
so how would you, I don't know, address that, I guess?
Well, first of all, on the labels, the negative labels, that type of thing, I always tell my millennial friends, just relax. Someday you're going to be one making those labels on the younger generation because you go back to the early '70s and the late '60s, early '70s. It was the baby boomers who were being labeled and misaligned. Gen X, I'm part of Gen X, obviously. Gen X, we were called slackers, we were called Goonies, we were Bad News Bears, we were Children of the Corn. I mean, we were Exorcists or Rosemary's Babies. I mean, we were all this, and that was just the wider culture as far as how media capsulized us. But we were the dumb generation. I don't know how many times I heard, "Oh, you guys are the dumb generation," because if you're Gen X, or back then, they didn't even have a name for us before Gen X. We were just the dumb generation, the slacker generation. But it's going to come around where millennials will eventually be the ones in the power, and they're going to be able to back at these young ones coming up, going, Usually, it takes about two generations back before you start seeing the disconnect. I'm 58 years old this year, and I'm seeing that disconnect, and with the younger generation, Gen Z, as it's starting to hit, and it's for me, it's more of an analysis now. I'm not wanting to disconnect. I feel the younger generation often disconnects from the older generation. It works both ways, but in many ways, there's always been this healthy skepticism of growing old. Back in the '60s, it was never trust anybody over 30. That was the mantra, you
Right.
know. But as you grow older, you just there's a reason. I write a lot about this when it comes to business because business people are always trying to figure out what's going on. But when you think about young people, what they're looking for when they come into the business culture, they're just looking to find some respect. Just respect me for who I am, and there's some respect also on the back end of it, but it's a different type of respect. Respect me for what I've done. You know, give me
Ah,
show, give me some credit. Maybe I actually know what I'm doing. Whereas we also need to give some respect to the younger generations coming in because we get caught up in ruts and traditions and that's the problem. The older generations do. We kind of this is the way we've always done it before,
right. You
and
do
so
what
we
we've
keep getting.
always done.
And the younger generation comes along and they push back on that, and they should. They should push back on it. That's what gives us new ideas and fresh moments and such. But that pushing back creates those. I don't say maybe not so much a disconnect, but more of a distortion, if you will, in the workplace. But you see it also. It's a big time happening in the church world. There's a huge disconnect and distortion going on right now in the church world because the younger generations are leaving, uh, organized, institutionalized religion, and they're kids that grew up in these. Just take the evangelical culture, grew up in these churches, these mega churches, and they've had the best children's ministries, the best youth ministries. More money has been poured into those ministries by these churches in the last 25 years, and yet uh, Gen Z, to use the word there, they're basically graduating, and they're going, I don't want anything to do with it. You know. By the way, I don't call them Gen Z.
What
My
do you call
tag for the generation born, and I cast them as being born from the year 2000 to the year 2020. So each one of these, my generations actually fold over each other. So you're part of two technological generations when you get into it, not one. So there's a
okay.
fluidness to these generations. So keep that in mind. I was born in 1963, so I'm part of the space generation born between 1950 and 1970, as well as the gamer generation born between 1960 and 1980. So
Whoa,
see
that's
that
the gamer generation?
the gamer
1960
generation,
to
yeah,
1980?
60 to 80.
Okay,
Yeah.
walk me through that one because I see gamers now big time. So what do you call gamers now?
Well, there's always realize every technology is going to have evolutions later,
Right?
but there's a generation that first experienced the gaming culture,
Okay, we're like
and
the
it was
Pac-Man fever kind of thing.
right. Well, the
Yeah,
first one, again, I was born in '63.
okay.
The very first one that came out was Pong. Pong was 1972. So you got to think 1972, I was 9 years old and I was ripe for Pong. I actually think that, Pong is the greatest video game ever created, because it's bloop, 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 bloop. I mean, it's very simple. Anybody can play it. It's wonderful. I actually think Jesus would have played Pong if he was here on the planet. He would have loved Pong. Hey, but that was the beginning of it all. And in the 1970s, video games started to come home a little bit through Atari and such, but it was the Pac-Man. Pac-Man was 1980, 81, 82. Those were the golden years. So you can see how that generation, if you were born between 1960 and you come of age, remember, you come of age at age 10, right? That's when you start coming of age. So if you're born in 1960 and you're coming of age in 1970, the predominant thing that's bursting for you is going to be gaming, the gaming technology.
Okay.
Television's already here. Yeah. Which is why right now, the newest generation that I've tagged the robo generation or robotics generation, born since 2010, what is bubbling right now? It's very easy to see this stuff when you start looking around. What's bubbling right now are robots. I mean, drones are nothing but robots, self-driving cars, the robots. But robots are literally. I bought a robot for Christmas for my wife. I bought her one of those robo vacuum cleaners.
Ah,
I couldn't believe it. Why did I wait so long? But I was in Sweden here a couple of years ago, and my Swedish relative, I woke up and we came in the dark and stuff. But at night, I kept hearing this something outside going on, and I woke up in the morning. I looked out, and they had robot lawnmowers in
yes.
Sweden. robot lawnmowers, and I was like fascinated. So I had to go out and take a look at that, and it was amazing. But my Swedish relative sells these things, so I asked him. I said, "How long has Sweden had robot lawnmowers?" Because we like to think of the United States as being on the cutting edge of technological evolution, But he said we've had them since 1995.
Really?
I go,
Okay,
wow.
that's a surprise to me.
So they
Okay,
were
my
very
nephew
primitive.
calls his, robotic lawnmower Molana, which I think is
Yeah,
really cute.
I like that, Molana. Yeah. I need one myself, but I have to have 3 because of my particular yard. Yeah.
Good
But
stuff.
anyway, yeah, so we went a lot of different places there. I bet you got a question or a comment, or what do you
I
think?
do. So I would like to see how we talked about how these labels can help us give a little bit of an idea of what a person's like, but it can also, or at least what their culture, what their experiences have been. But it is can be a form of that disconnect of labeling, which gives kind of an us them, which I do not love. Is there a way that we can use these labels to help create some connection and to some understanding between different cultures, different groups, different ages?
Well, and I think that's where, again, these technological labels are a little bit more positive. I mean, we can understand the internet generation. We can understand, oh yeah, you're part of the iTech generation. That Generation Z. I don't call them Generation Z. I don't think if I answered this one entirely. I call them the iTechs, little I, big T,
Okay.
because of all the I technologies they experienced when they came of age. Remember, they were born in 2000. By 2010, the iPod, the iPad, and the iPhone. All 3 of those are the big ones that
Yeah.
had popped for them. And I mean, they had the Gen Z, or I call them the iTech generation. When they went to kindergarten, they all got iPads. You
Ooh.
know, when they came of age, at 10 years of age, they all got smartphones. You know, and a lot of that's that I technology going on. Yeah. But I think the labels help us, especially these technological labels, get us away from these classic labels that we don't identify with. Why do people in my generation, we just kind of Gen X? Come on. It's because Gen X means nothing.
Right.
Millennials actually has probably the closest, baby boomers also to a certain extent, but millennials, at least, you know why they're called millennials, don't you, Linda?
Well, the millennium, I mean, year
Yeah,
2000.
right. Because their first birth year was 1982. So they when they graduated high school, they graduated in the year 2000. So they were called millennial babies. Strauss and Howe. I tried to run this down for the book because I'm like 98%. You know how you're 98% sure on this fact, but you can't find it when you really need it?
Oh,
I'm
that's
98% sure on this fact. But as I recall, in 1982, one of the reasons why they were called millennial babies was because in 1982 there was a longitudinal study that was launched to follow a cohort. I think it were like 2,000 babies, because they wanted to do 2,000 babies to the year 2000. That was the idea. We're going to study these babies. We're going to study everything about them to the year 2000 when they graduate high school, and they called them millennial babies. And for the life of me, I can't find that particular study to, maybe just no longer exists or something. But as I recall, that's why Strauss and Howe used the word millennial with them. It was
yeah.
actually a scientific reason. Well, that makes some sense. Okay, but
It's
Gen
not in their
Z,
book? Seems like that, but yeah, yeah, yeah. I like the idea of at least if you're gonna give a label that it has some kind of a meaning and a connection so that
yeah.
you can see, "Oh, that means that they've experienced this and they've experienced that." So we're talking about culture, we're talking about things that are happening right now, but you also talk about history and that connection. And I know some of my kids, when they went to college and they were studying history, their history professor would say, "This really doesn't matter. There's no connection between what was and what is. It's just stuff that happened." And I thought, wow, how can you study something and become a professor at it and have that kind of a feeling toward it? I feel like understanding our history gives us a better understanding of who we are and a better appreciation. So how do you feel about history and that connection? I mean, we're talking about now and the new creations and the new technology and how the new things are affecting us. How does the old stuff affect us?
Well, I think that's where my doctoral work really helped me out. In my doctorate, I studied the science of semiotics, looking at signs, cultural signs, and and learning what's known as futurism. My professor, my mentor was a futurist, and in many ways, I guess I would be called a futurist as well because a lot of the work I do is helping organizations and businesses and churches and schools understand where we're going and try to help them. For example, if you actually think the paper book, the printed book, is going to be around in 20 years, you, you're not seeing you're not reading the tea leaves on the wall. Our culture is changing fast enough. By the year 2030, I write this in the book, and I really believe it. There has been more. The reason I started in the book with 1900 was because there's been more technological change in the last 120 years than in the entire history of the world.
Yep.
Just since 1900, there's been
Crazy.
more technological change. However, since the year 2000, there has been in the last 20 years more technological change than in the previous century, and
Wow.
we don't realize that because we're living it. We're living at this speed of technological life, and it's just going faster and faster and faster. But buckle up, Buttercup, because I got to tell you, in the next 10 years, by the year 2030, we're going to look back and we're going to see more technological change in the next 10 years than we have in the last 20. And that's because the hairy technologies are bubbling. We're moving into a hairy culture, HAIR, holographic, artificial intelligence, and robotic.
Okay.
It's a hair culture that's coming, and those acronyms. So, when you think in the year 2030, you and I will be holograms. We'll be able to present ourselves as holograms. We'll be able to go to concerts. I believe by 2030, you'll be able to go and watch the Beatles as they were in 1964 and actually think you're at the concert because they can
Wow.
holographically present them. They're already doing that. Here in Boise, a couple of years ago, we had Buddy Holly and Roy Orbison on stage in hologram. You know,
That's
that
amazing.
isn't that amazing? Yeah. But but when you think about artificial intelligence, we've had robots since 1937. Actually, even earlier than that, 26, 27 was the first robot. In fact, I think that's where the word robot actually emerged, was in the late 1920s. But we've had robots, but they've always been those mechanical robots. But what's happening with artificial intelligence is it's melding. Artificial intelligence and robotics are melding. So our robots are actually becoming learning machines. They're becoming like Data was in Star Trek: The Next Generation,
Yeah. Great
a
character.
learning machine, and they learn you. There are robots in Japan, for example, that are reporters. They report the news and they do interviews, and
Really?
they look scarily human. Yeah, all I have to do is do a little YouTube. My last chapter, when I talked about robots, and I did some heavy research on YouTube and what's coming. But I'm not sure if I remember what your original question was, but I had to get that point in. But I think you're talking
We're talking about
about
yeah, how we're talking about the present and the culture and
right. Okay.
technology, but we were wondering I was wondering
Yeah.
how the past affects the present. I mean, does it even matter? Or do we just forget the past because there's so much going on right now and so much coming in the future that we should just abandon the past because there's a whole lot of people who think that that's the way to go.
First of all, thank you for getting me back on track. So sometimes I get ripping. I go, oh my, forgot the original question. Well, again, back to my doctor really helped me with this because what I learned was in order to be a good futurist, you have to be a great historian. And what historians do, the great historians, the ones that we look to as a culture to help us understand our present and position us for the future, is they see the patterns. There are patterns. If you want a great historian, you have one on the news every single night at 5 or 6 o'clock. They're called weather forecasters. What's
Ah,
a weather forecaster do? All they do is analyze the past. They look back at the patterns of weather history. They know that if a cold front does this, the winds do this, or the rains do that, that it's going to produce. They've seen the patterns, and then those patterns give us the ability to predict. We're not 100%, but we can predict. The more the pattern repeats, the more we can be predictive about the future, which is why when it comes to technology, I can be very predictive in saying that the printed book probably in 10 years will be very much like a record album is today. Now, a lot of people say the
very fun.
record albums are making a comeback. Yeah, well, that's true, but
A
it's a
novelty,
high end
though.
market. I mean, if you're willing to pay $25 for a record, it's a very niche market uh, that it sells to. The record album is not making a comeback. It's just a fad within a particular niche market. The same thing's going to happen to the book, in my opinion. We're seeing right now the digitization of everything, and when books, we're almost to that point. We're in fact, I think we're right there. We're so close that when we tip, the tipping point for digitization of the book is right on the. And when it goes, it's going to go very quickly, and you're going to see people unloading their books like we unloaded, our records at garage sales, or our cassette tapes at garage sales, or our 8-track tapes for the thrift shop. It's coming, and I'm a book guy. If I turn this screen around, my entire room is books. I live in a library. Love books. You do too.
I
Yeah.
do too. I love books. And I agree that things are changing, and I can totally see that. But one thing that I see that's a little bit different between the record player and a book is a
Okay.
record player or a record requires a record player. Your cassette tape requires that piece of technology that becomes obsolete. But the book just requires me, a person, to open it and to read the pages. And
Right.
hopefully, I'm still going to exist and I'm still going to have hands. I can pick up a book and I'm still going to have eyes that I can read and I'm going to have the ability to read because I learned that one. Although I totally see it, it is so much less expensive to be able to digitize and just to be able to send something out than it is to go through the process of printing. But there is that little bit of distinction where the thing that reads the book is not going to become obsolete. That's me. Unless I choose not to read a book. I guess that's a choice.
Right. But are you planning on living forever?
No, I'm going to die.
Yeah.
Not
See that?
today, but, not in the next 10 years, I hope.
Yeah. Well, but see, that's my point. Is that every generation grows old, and we grow old with our technology that we have embraced all of our lives. That makes us feel comfortable.
True.
But look at the young generation. I mean, we've heard a lot in this last year about Zoom and digital education and all that. A lot of the beefing that I heard, a lot of the complaint I heard was coming from the adults, not from the kids. If the kids were echoing it, they were echoing what their parents were saying about it. And of course, kids are going to say, kids have always said, I hate school. Okay. So for them to say, I hate Zoom and I hate doing digital school, I mean, are we really surprised at that? But here's the thing, they adapted very easily to it because in a Zoom culture, in a digital culture, they're so used to manipulating and going around and doing everything digital already. They've been going to school without textbooks except in their digital backpack, as they call it. They're going to be primed. They've done online education already a lot in their life. Here in Idaho, where I live, it's required that you have to take an online course before you graduate
Oh,
because we actually,
really?
yeah, our education system believes that you need to know how to do online. But here in Idaho, uh, I'm going to be very liberal in this statistic because it's a few years old. But my son, for example, completed his high school degree his senior year. He had an option between being in a band and traveling around the Northwest United States playing music and going to high school for his final year. And he chose to tour with the band and take his final year online. And he graduated. He never even walked. He never even walked. But at that time, the statistic was about 45% of all Idaho high school students are purely online students, and a lot of that's homeschool people too,
Mhm.
obviously. But when you figure that only 55% were actually going to a brick and mortar school, you think brick and mortar schools are going to be around in 20, 30 years?
Don't
You
know.
know,
Guess we'll
probably.
find
Uh,
out.
Education is transforming. Everything is transforming right now. COVID was not an interruption. A lot of people think COVID-19 was just an interruption and we're going to go back to normal. Uh-uh. It's a disruption. And the sooner we recognize it as a disruption and recognize that there's going to be some new normals. Case in point, my wife right now downstairs, she's about ready to head out to go pick up the groceries. Because of COVID, she started ordering groceries online and then she just picks them up. She just picks them up, you know? But that's not That's not the way she did it before. She always sent me. I always did all the grocery shopping. I haven't grocery shopped in a year.
Wow.
And it's interesting. Walmart has identified that in a big way. They've recognized that a lot of their shoppers aren't going to come back to the store. They're just going to continue to pick up. So their number one hire at Walmart's right now are personal shoppers. Those people who pick up for other, buy for other people.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the business has transformed,
Yes.
and the church again, the church has seen the same thing. The statistics are showing right now that church attendance, physical church attendance, is down anywhere from 30 to 70%, depending on the church, from pre-COVID. And that's because a lot of people are not, they're just not going to come back, because they found that, hey, I'm getting the same experience sitting on my couch watching you through a screen on Sunday morning or Saturday or whatever I want when I watch it. You know?
Interesting. So with all of this information that you have, this I would say skill set in understanding and recognizing the changes and how they affect us, is there a takeaway that we can get from this that makes us be a little bit better or a little bit more hopeful to say, oh, because I know this and because I understand this, then I can fill in the blank, or does that make sense?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I think again, history is our best help. Uh, the last time we had this big moment where we really, as a culture, especially American culture, really struggled with the future was in the late 1800s, as we started to move into that industrial period. Everything was being industrialized. And the big question was, where are the jobs going to come from? How are we, what's going to, and essentially what happened was we figured it out. We figured it out, and the 9 to 5 job, or the 8 to 5 job, was created. In fact, the entire middle class, as we call it, is a result. It's a consequence. Most people don't think about this, but we didn't have a middle class before the Industrial Revolution. We had upper class, and we had everybody else. But the middle class that had a stable environment, that actually had the ability to buy a home, to own property, that's all the result of the Industrial Revolution. But there were all sorts of articles and books and, you know, sermons and everything else, just communication in the late 1800s that was saying, "Hey, we're in trouble. You know, how are we going to get through this? Because where are the jobs going to come from? What, you know, we're not all going to move into the factory." They just couldn't figure. They couldn't understand how it was going to work. That's the same thing I see right now. If you look and think about what's going on in our employment, let's just talk employment. A lot of places right now can't find anybody to work for them. There's jobs out there like crazy, and then there's all these people, nobody. But what's happening, and we don't realize this, is we're seeing a transformation of the workplace. We are seeing, again, robots are going to be the next thing. And as these robots replace people, people aren't coming back. Who's going to come back and build your burger for you in the future? Believe it or not, it's not going to be an 18-year-old kid looking for a summer job. It's going to be a robot that's going to build your computer. They're already building pizzas. There are robots right now that pick fruit. There are robots that, in fact, down in California, they're test casing a robot semi tractor trailer truck that's a self-driving tractor trailer. And in the future, they believe truck drivers will be obsolete. Police will be obsolete. We won't need police and firemen in the future because robots will take those jobs. Why would you send a fireman into a dangerous situation, or a human into a very dangerous situation, when a robot can go in there and do the work and take the water right in there? The robots are going to take over so many parts of our place. And the big thing that the big takeaway is, well, how are we going to deal with this? This is madness. This is what happens when the robots become smarter than us, and we start having these fear factors go on. And all I can say is relax, because there's one thing that robots can't do, is they can't emote. They can't emote. We learned that from Data in Star Trek. They've tried to put an emotional chip in him. It never worked. Robots, they will never be able to create. There's always going to be something in the human element that's special and unique. And I believe it's divine. I believe that it's because of a divine nature that we have that makes us, you speak. We're going to be above the robots. So we're still going to, we can be positive. We can be hopeful. Life is
I
it's going to
like that.
change.
So
Yeah.
that takeaway with all the things that we've learned and with all the changes that we are able to adapt, it's going to be okay. With one of the things about the COVID and people panicked, it's like this happened 100 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, we're after them, so things worked out and it's going to be okay. So I love that as a final takeaway. And I appreciate so much your enthusiasm and to be able to talk with you today and to be able to listen and to learn. It's been delightful. Thank you so much, Rick.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Linda. Appreciate the time.
In closing, I'd like to share a quote from the ancient Roman statesman Marcus Tullius Cicero. He said, "To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. For what is the worth of a human life unless it is woven into the life of our ancestors by the records of history?" Today, I invite you to become more aware of how culture, technology, and history are influencing your life and how you are influencing history. See you next time on Linda's Corner.